Have you ever been told you're not management material because of your gender? Hit that subscribe button. Subscribe if you believe that people who use discrimination as a weapon eventually face someone who's learned to use policy as justice, because what I'm about to tell you proves that sometimes the person who destroys your career becomes the reason you build one powerful enough to destroy theirs. My name is Fallon. I'm 36 years old. And the day I walked into the HR director's office with documentation of his decade-long pattern of gender discrimination was the day I finally understood that revenge served cold isn't about anger. It's about precision. But before I tell you about that termination meeting where he finally recognized the woman he'd dismissed years ago, let me take you back to where ambition met bias and patience became weaponized, because every story of reckoning starts with someone telling you that you don't belong. I started working at Meridian Technologies when I was 25 years old as a junior analyst in their operations department. Meridian was a mid-sized tech company specializing in enterprise software solutions, the kind of business that was profitable but not particularly innovative or forward-thinking. I'd graduated with honors in business management and had spent 2 years at a smaller firm learning operational efficiency strategies. The Meridian job was a step up, better pay and more responsibility, and I was eager to prove myself. The operations director who hired me was a woman named Petra, who seemed genuinely committed to building a diverse team. She saw potential in me and gave me increasingly complex projects. Within 18 months, I'd streamlined 3 major operational workflows, saving the company over $200,000 annually. I was performing at a senior level despite my junior title. When a senior analyst position opened, Petra encouraged me to apply. "You're ready for this," she told me during our one-on-one meeting. "Your work has been exceptional, and you've demonstrated leadership skills beyond your current role. I'm recommending you for promotion." I applied feeling confident and prepared. I had the metrics to support my candidacy. I delivered measurable results, received positive performance reviews, and had Petra's strong endorsement. The promotion required HR approval, which seemed like a formality. The HR director was a man named Quinton. He'd been with Meridian for 12 years, rising from recruiter to director of human resources. He had a reputation for being thorough, fair, and by the book. I'd never interacted with him directly, but I'd heard he was professional and generally well regarded. My interview with Quinton for the promotion was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. I arrived 15 minutes early, prepared with a portfolio documenting my contributions and ready to discuss my qualifications. Quinton kept me waiting 30 minutes before finally calling me into his office. He didn't stand when I entered, didn't shake my hand, just gestured to a chair while continuing to type on his computer. "Give me a moment," he said without looking up. I sat quietly, watching him finish whatever email was apparently more important than our scheduled meeting. After another 5 minutes, he finally turned his attention to me. "So Fallon," he said, leaning back in his chair, "Petra says you want a promotion. I'd like to be considered for the senior analyst position," I replied professionally. "I believe my performance warrants the advancement." Quinton picked up my file, flipping through pages without really reading them. "You've been here, 18 months? That's not very long." "I've delivered significant results in that time," I said, pulling out my portfolio. "I have documentation of the operational improvements I've implemented and the cost savings generated." He waved his hand dismissively. "Numbers on paper. Anyone can show metrics. What I care about is whether you're actually ready for leadership." "I am ready," I said firmly. "Petra believes I'm prepared, and my track record supports that assessment." Quinton smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "Petra is a nice woman, but she's perhaps too eager to promote people before they're truly ready. Leadership requires more than just doing good work. It requires a certain presence, a gravitas that commands respect. Honestly, looking at you, I don't see that." "What exactly do you see?" I asked, feeling heat creep up my neck. He leaned forward, his tone patronizing. "I see a young woman who's done adequate work but who lacks the maturity and authority necessary for senior-level responsibilities. Management is about making tough decisions, commanding rooms, being taken seriously by clients and colleagues. That requires a certain type of personality. The implication was crystal clear. He was saying I lacked leadership qualities because I was a woman, though he was careful not to use those exact words. I've successfully led project teams, I protested. I've presented to senior management. I've demonstrated exactly the capabilities you're describing. In limited contexts, he said. But scaling that to a senior role is different. I'm denying your promotion application. You need at least another 2 years in your current role before you should apply again. Maybe 3. By then you might have developed the necessary maturity. I left that meeting stunned and furious. I went straight to Petra and told her what happened. Her face darkened as I recounted the conversation. That's gender discrimination, she said bluntly. He basically told you that you're not promotable because you're a young woman. Can we fight this? I asked. Petra sighed heavily. We can try. But Quinton has been here a long time and has built relationships with senior leadership. Fighting him directly could backfire and damage your career here. I felt trapped. Fighting meant potentially losing my job entirely. Accepting the decision meant staying stuck in a role I'd outgrown. Over the next week, I watched as the senior analyst position was offered to a man named Troy who'd been with the company for less time than me and had significantly less impressive performance metrics. He accepted, and suddenly I was reporting to someone I'd been outperforming for over a year. The injustice burned, but I didn't know what to do about it. Then Petra called me into her office with bad news. I'm leaving Meridian, she said quietly. I've accepted a position at another company. I can't stay here knowing what Quinton did to you and knowing I don't have the power to fix it. Before I go, I want to tell you something important. Quinton has done this before, she continued. I've heard rumors from other women in the company about similar experiences. Promotions denied with vague justifications about maturity or presence. Performance issues cited that don't appear in formal reviews. He's careful to avoid explicit discrimination, but the pattern is clear. Document everything, Petra advised. Every interaction with Quinton, every performance review, every time you're passed over for advancement. If you ever have the opportunity to hold him accountable, you'll need evidence. I took her advice seriously. I started keeping detailed records. Dates, times, conversations, witnesses, everything. I documented my performance metrics and saved every positive review. I noted every time a less qualified man was promoted over a qualified woman. I built a file that grew steadily over the months that followed. Meanwhile, my career at Meridian stagnated. Despite continuing to deliver excellent work, I was repeatedly passed over for promotions. Each time, Quinton found reasons why I wasn't ready. Too inexperienced. Lacks executive presence. Not quite ready for that level of responsibility. The justifications were always just vague enough to avoid being obviously discriminatory. After 3 years of this pattern, I made a decision. I couldn't change Meridian from inside. Not with Quinton controlling HR decisions. So I'd leave, build my credentials elsewhere, and come back when I had power he couldn't dismiss. I took a job at a larger tech company as a senior operations manager, the role Meridian had repeatedly denied me. I excelled immediately, proving Quinton's assessment had been wrong. Within 2 years, I was promoted to Director of Operations. 2 years after that, I was Vice President of Operational Excellence, overseeing teams across multiple departments. I also went back to school, earning a master's degree in organizational leadership and getting certified in employment law and workplace compliance. I wanted to understand discrimination not just from experience but from a legal and policy perspective. I wanted to become the kind of professional who could dismantle bias systems. By the time I was 33 years old, I'd built an impressive resume. VP at a Fortune 500 company. Advanced degrees. Certifications in HR compliance and employment law. I'd transformed myself from the young analyst Quinton had dismissed into someone with credentials and expertise he couldn't question. Then I got a call from a recruiter about an opportunity that felt like destiny. Meridian Technologies was looking for a chief compliance officer. The role would oversee all HR practices, employment policies, and regulatory compliance. It would report directly to the CEO and would have authority over all departments including HR. Would you be interested in interviewing? The recruiter asked. I was very interested. The interview process was extensive. I met with the CEO, several board members, and department heads. No one seemed to remember me from my brief time as a junior analyst 8 years earlier. I'd changed my appearance, grown more confident, and carried myself with the executive presence Quinton had claimed I lacked. The CEO, a man named Sterling, explained why they needed this role. We've had some concerns raised about our workplace culture, he said carefully. Nothing formal, but enough whispers about bias and unfair treatment that the board wants someone senior focused on compliance and creating an equitable environment. Have you identified specific problem areas? I asked. Sterling hesitated. Our HR practices have been flagged as potentially inconsistent. We need someone who can audit everything, identify issues, and implement changes. Someone with no existing loyalties to current staff who might resist reform. I'm very capable of objective assessment, I assured him. And I have extensive experience identifying and correcting systemic bias in organizational structures. They offered me the position 2 weeks later. Chief Compliance Officer with full authority to investigate, audit, and reform any policies or practices that created legal or ethical risk. My salary was triple what I'd made as a junior analyst. My authority was absolute in matters of compliance and discrimination. Accepted immediately. My first day at Meridian was 8 years, almost to the day after I'd left. I walked into the building as an executive rather than a junior employee. I had a corner office, an executive assistant, and a mandate from the CEO to clean up any problems I found. My first week was spent in orientation meetings, learning about current policies and procedures. I met with department heads, reviewed HR documentation, and asked questions about how decisions were made regarding hiring, promotion, and termination. Everyone was professional and cooperative. No one mentioned knowing me from before. Then, on Friday afternoon, I had a scheduled meeting with Quinton Shaw. He walked into my office looking confident and relaxed, clearly viewing this as a routine introduction to a new executive. He extended his hand with a professional smile. Quinton Shaw, Director of Human Resources, he said. Welcome to Meridian. It's good to have someone focused on compliance. We run a tight ship in HR, but I'm happy to answer any questions. I shook his hand, watching his face carefully for any sign of recognition. There was none. 8 years, significant physical changes, and my new position of authority had rendered me invisible to him in a different way. I have quite a few questions, I said, gesturing for him to sit. I've been reviewing HR practices and I'd like to understand your decision-making processes for promotions and advancement. We have robust processes, Quinton said easily. Performance reviews, manager recommendations, assessment of readiness for increased responsibility. It's all very thorough and objective. Walk me through a recent promotion decision, I requested. How do you evaluate whether someone is ready to advance? Quinton launched into an explanation of their promotion framework. As he talked, I recognized the language he'd used with me 8 years ago. Phrases like executive presence and gravitas and maturity appeared repeatedly. These were his code words for bias. His ways of gatekeeping opportunities based on subjective assessments rather than objective performance. Over the next month, I conducted a comprehensive audit of HR practices. I reviewed 5 years of promotion decisions, hiring choices, and termination records. I analyzed the data by gender, race, age, and other protected categories. The patterns were damning. Women were promoted at half the rate of men despite representing 40% of the workforce. Women's performance reviews included significantly more subjective criticism than men's. Women were disproportionately placed in non-revenue-generating roles that offered fewer advancement opportunities. The bias was systemic, consistent, and clearly centered in HR decision-making. I documented everything meticulously. Charts showing promotion disparities. Analysis of performance review language revealing gender-based differences. Testimony from women who'd been passed over for advancement in favor of less qualified men. I built a case that was impossible to dismiss or explain away. Then I did something Quinton had taught me years ago. I documented my own experience. I pulled my old personnel file from the archives. I reviewed the promotion denial from 8 years earlier. I compared my performance metrics to Troy's, the man who'd been promoted instead of me. The evidence showed clearly that I'd been more qualified and had been denied advancement based on gender bias. I added my story to the larger pattern, one example among dozens of how Quinton had systematically discriminated against women throughout his tenure as HR director. I presented my findings to the CEO and board of directors in a closed session. The presentation took 90 minutes and left the room in stunned silence. "This is a significant liability exposure," Sterling finally said. "If any of these women decided to sue for discrimination, we'd have very little defense." "Multiple women could join a class action," I agreed. "The pattern is clear and well documented. What you're showing us could cost the company millions in settlements and damage our reputation severely. What do you recommend?" "Immediate termination of Quinton Shaw," I said clearly. "He's the source of these discriminatory practices. Additionally, we need to implement new HR oversight, mandatory bias training, and a formal review process for all promotion and hiring decisions. We also need to proactively reach out to women who were harmed by these practices and make appropriate remedies." The board member asked the question I'd been waiting for. "Do you have personal history with Mr. Shaw that might bias your assessment?" "I do," I admitted. 8 years ago, I worked here as a junior analyst. Quinton denied my promotion application using the same discriminatory language he's used with other women. I have documentation of that interaction in the file I provided. My personal experience led me to look for patterns, but the patterns exist independent of my involvement. The board was quiet, reviewing the documentation. Another member spoke up. "If you have personal history, should you be handling this matter?" Might appear vindictive. "My personal experience makes me uniquely qualified to identify discrimination that others might dismiss as legitimate business judgment," I replied. "But if the board is uncomfortable with my involvement, I'm happy to step back and let outside counsel handle the investigation. They'll reach the same conclusions I have because the evidence is overwhelming." Sterling shook his head. "No, your involvement is appropriate given your role. We hired you to identify compliance issues. You've done exactly that. We need to act on your recommendations." The board voted unanimously to terminate Quinton Shaw for cause based on a documented pattern of discriminatory practices. I was authorized to handle the termination personally and to implement immediate reforms to prevent future discrimination. The termination meeting was scheduled for the following Monday morning. Quinton was told he had a meeting with the chief compliance officer to discuss HR practices. He had no idea what was coming. I prepared for that meeting more carefully than anything I'd done in my entire career. I had documentation organized chronologically. I had legal counsel on standby. I had security prepared in case the termination became confrontational. Most importantly, I had a statement prepared that would make absolutely clear why this was happening. Monday morning arrived. Quinton walked into my office at 9 a.m. sharp, carrying a coffee and looking relaxed. He still didn't recognize me. "Morning," he said pleasantly. "You wanted to discuss some HR practices." "Sit down, Quinton," I said, my tone formal. "We need to have a serious conversation." His expression shifted slightly, picking up on my tone. "Is there a problem?" "There's a significant problem," I replied. "Over the past month, I've conducted a comprehensive audit of HR practices at Meridian Technologies. I've identified a clear and consistent pattern of gender discrimination in promotion decisions, performance evaluations, and advancement opportunities. The pattern is centered in your decision-making as HR director." Quinton's face went pale. "That's a serious accusation." "It's a documented fact," I corrected, sliding a folder across my desk. "This contains 5 years of data showing women are promoted at half the rate of men despite equal or superior performance. It includes analysis of performance review language revealing gender-based bias. It documents multiple instances where qualified women were passed over for advancement in favor of less qualified men." Quinton opened the folder. his hands shaking slightly as he flipped through pages. "This is taken out of context," he protested. "These were legitimate business decisions based on qualifications and readiness." "Let me give you a specific example," I said, pulling out another document. 8 years ago, a junior analyst named Fallon worked in operations. She had 18 months of exceptional performance, had saved the company over $200,000, and was recommended for promotion by her director. You denied that promotion, citing lack of maturity and executive presence. Do you remember that decision? Quinton looked confused. 8 years ago. I don't remember every personnel decision from that long ago. Let me refresh your memory, I said, leaning forward. You told her she was too young, too inexperienced, that she lacked the gravitas necessary for leadership. You told her she needed 2 to 3 more years before reapplying. Then you promoted a less qualified man named Troy to that same position within weeks. Understanding started dawning on Quinton's face. He looked at me more carefully, really seeing me for the first time. His eyes widened. "You," he whispered. "I'm that junior analyst," I confirmed. "The one you dismissed as not ready for leadership. The one you discriminated against using the same pattern you've applied to dozens of women over the past decade. I left Meridian, built my credentials elsewhere, earned advanced degrees and certifications, and worked my way to executive level. Now I'm the chief compliance officer tasked with cleaning up the discriminatory practices you've embedded in this organization." Quinton's face went from pale to red. "This is revenge," he said, his voice rising. "You've manufactured a case against me because I made one decision you disagreed with 8 years ago." "I haven't manufactured anything," I replied calmly. "The data is objective. Pattern is clear. Your discrimination affected dozens of women, not just me. My personal experience helped me recognize what to look for, but what I found exists independent of my involvement." Quinton stood up abruptly. "I'm not accepting this. I've given 12 years to this company. I have excellent performance reviews. You can't destroy my career because of a personal grudge." "I'm not destroying your career," I said, standing to face him. "You destroyed your own career through years of discriminatory practices that violated employment law and company policy. I'm simply documenting what you did and holding you accountable." Quinton looked desperate. "I want to speak to Sterling. I want to present my side of this. The CEO and board have already reviewed all documentation," I informed him. "They voted unanimously to terminate your employment for cause, effective immediately. Your access to company systems has been revoked. Security will escort you from the building after we complete exit paperwork." "You can't do this," Quinton said, but his voice had lost its conviction. He knew he'd lost. "I can and I have," I replied. "You taught me an important lesson 8 years ago, Quinton. You taught me that people in power can use subjective judgments to deny opportunities to those they consider lesser. You were right about that. Power does allow for subjective judgment. The difference is, I'm using my power to dismantle discrimination rather than perpetuate it." Security knocked on my door, having been summoned by my assistant. Quinton stared at me with something between rage and disbelief. "I never did anything illegal," he said quietly. "Every decision I made was within my authority as HR director." "You're right," I agreed. "You were very careful to avoid explicitly illegal discrimination. You used code words like maturity and presence and gravitas. You made sure your bias was undeniable. But patterns don't lie, Quinton. When the same subjective standards are applied differently based on gender, that's discrimination regardless of how carefully you disguise it." Quinton left my office escorted by security, carrying a box of personal items and a termination letter outlining the cause. I watched him go, feeling something between satisfaction and emptiness. I'd waited 8 years for this moment. I'd built an entire career toward having the power to hold him accountable. Now that it was done, the victory felt more clinical than triumphant. Over the next 6 months, I implemented sweeping HR reforms at Meridian Technologies. We created objective promotion criteria based on measurable performance metrics rather than subjective assessments. We implemented blind resume screening to reduce unconscious bias in hiring. We established an oversight committee that reviewed all promotion decisions for potential discrimination. We also reached out to women who'd been harmed by Quinton's discriminatory practices. We offered back pay adjustments for promotions they should have received. We provided opportunities for advancement with expedited consideration. We made financial settlements to those who'd left the company because of discrimination. It was expensive, costing Meridian over $3 million in remedies and lost productivity during reform implementation. But it was necessary. The company's culture began shifting. Women started advancing at rates comparable to men. Performance reviews became more objective and focused on actual contributions rather than subjective personality assessments. Meridian's reputation as an employer improved, allowing us to attract better talent. 1 year after Quinton's termination, I received a message through LinkedIn. It was from him. The message was brief but striking in its tone. Fallon, I've spent the past year in therapy and doing a lot of reflection about my career and behavior. I want you to know that I finally understand what I did was wrong. Not just to you but to all the women I held back over the years. I convinced myself I was making legitimate business judgments, but I was really just perpetuating bias I'd absorbed without examining. I'm not asking for forgiveness or for you to feel sorry for me. I'm just acknowledging that you were right to hold me accountable. What you did, documenting everything and building an irrefutable case, that was justice. I deserved to lose my career for how I used my power to harm others. I hope the changes you've implemented at Meridian last. I hope the women I hurt have found opportunities elsewhere or at Meridian under new leadership. And I hope you know that while I'll always regret how I treated you and others, I'm grateful that someone finally stopped me. I read the message 3 times, surprised by its apparent sincerity. I didn't respond immediately. I needed time to process whether this was genuine accountability or another manipulation. A week later I replied simply, Quinton, accountability is the first step toward change. I hope your reflection leads to genuine growth. What you did harmed real people with real careers and real lives. The fact that you're beginning to understand that is progress, but it doesn't undo the damage. I built my career partly to prove you wrong about me and partly to ensure you couldn't hurt others the way you hurt me. I accomplished both goals. Whether you've changed or will change isn't my concern anymore. That's work you have to do for yourself. I do hope you succeed in becoming better, not for my benefit but for any future colleagues or employees who might encounter you. The system that allowed you to discriminate for years without consequence is what needed changing most. That's why my focus has been on reform rather than just revenge. I didn't hear from Quinton again. Through professional networks, I learned he'd taken a non-HR role at a small nonprofit, working in operations rather than people management. His career had effectively ended in human resources. His reputation in the industry permanently damaged by the documented discrimination. Meanwhile, my career continued ascending. Meridian's successful cultural transformation became a case study in how companies could address systemic bias. I was invited to speak at conferences about implementing objective promotion criteria and dismantling discriminatory systems. I published articles about using compliance frameworks to identify and correct workplace discrimination. My reputation grew as someone who combined legal expertise with real-world experience of bias. 3 years after Quinton's termination, I was recruited to be Chief People Officer at a major tech company with over 10,000 employees. The role combined HR leadership with compliance oversight, allowing me to build equitable systems from the top rather than reforming broken ones. It was the culmination of everything I'd learned and fought for. At my farewell event at Meridian, Sterling gave a speech acknowledging my impact. When we hired Fallon as Chief Compliance Officer, he said, "We knew we needed someone tough enough to identify problems and skilled enough to fix them." What we didn't anticipate was how transformative her leadership would be. She didn't just identify discrimination. She built systems that prevent it. She didn't just hold one person accountable. She changed our entire culture. The company she's leaving is fundamentally different and better than the one she joined. Several women approached me after the event to share their stories. Women who'd been promoted under the new objective criteria. Women who'd received back pay for past discrimination. Women who'd stayed at Meridian because they finally felt valued and fairly treated. "Thank you," one woman said, tears in her eyes. "I was ready to leave because I kept getting passed over despite strong performance. The changes you made gave me hope that things could actually be different. This is the organization I wanted to work for all along." Those conversations meant more than any executive title or salary increase. They confirmed that what I'd done mattered beyond personal vindication. Quinton's discrimination had hurt real people. The systems I'd built to replace his biased practices had helped real people. That was the legacy I wanted. Today, I'm 36 years old with a career built partially on experiencing discrimination and entirely on fighting it. I'm Chief People Officer at a company committed to equity and inclusion. I mentor women in tech who face bias similar to what I experienced. I teach executives how to identify and dismantle discriminatory systems in their organizations. And occasionally, I think about Quinton and the lesson he inadvertently taught me. He showed me how power could be abused to harm people. I learned to build power specifically to protect people from that harm. He used subjective standards to deny opportunities. I created objective standards to distribute opportunities fairly. He thought I lacked the maturity and presence for leadership. I proved that real leadership means using authority to serve justice rather than personal bias. The irony is perfect. Quinton destroyed my early career trajectory because of his discrimination. That destruction motivated me to build something stronger and more impactful than what I would have built without that obstacle. His worst act became the catalyst for my best work. If someone had told a 25-year-old me, sitting in that office being told I wasn't ready for promotion, that 8 years later I'd return as the executive who ended his career, I wouldn't have believed them. The journey from junior analyst to chief compliance officer seemed impossible from that position of powerlessness. But powerlessness is temporary when you refuse to accept it as permanent. If this story showed you that people who discriminate eventually face someone who's learned to weaponize policy against bias, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories about turning discrimination into determination and using compliance as justice. Drop a comment about a time someone underestimated you based on gender or any other characteristic and how you proved them wrong. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction. It's building systems so effective at preventing harm that the person who harmed you becomes irrelevant. Sometimes justice means not just holding one person accountable but changing entire organizations so discrimination can't hide behind subjective standards anymore. And sometimes the person someone dismisses as not ready becomes exactly the person with power to ensure no one else gets dismissed the same way. Subscribe and see you in the next story.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoy watching Karma, Payback, come full circle every week, we dive into tales of betrayal and poetic justice. Don't miss the next one. Tap the subscribe button and join the Revenge Squad.